Alright guys, so today we're going to start with our first ancient civilization that we'll cover this year. That'll kind of be the focus for most of the rest of the school year for us. We kind of covered the topical stuff here at the beginning of the year. Now we're actually going to get into the different groups of people and the different civilizations. And most of the civilizations that we're going to talk about are the ones that settled next to rivers, or lived in these river valleys. So the first one we're going to talk about is an area called Mesopotamia. But Mesopotamia is part of an area that we call the Fertile Crescent. And that Fertile Crescent is made up of three major rivers. You've got the Nile River, the Tigris River, and the Euphrates River. Now, this part of the world where that Fertile Crescent is located, and I'll show it to you on a map here in a second, is around North Africa and Southwest Asia. But this part of the world is very, very dry. It gets very little rain throughout the year. It is a desert region. So, to kind of give you an idea of just how dry it is, a lot of it looks like this. A lot of sand, a lot of rock, not a whole lot of green as you would go through it. So, because of that, the groups of people that would settle in this area had to rely on these rivers for a lot of different things. So, this is your Nile River. Okay, it's the one that's highlighted here in yellow. But it is the longest river in the world. Okay, it's like 4,123 miles. Okay, so very, very long river. And I'll show you a different picture over here in a second. But pretty much anything on either side of this river is desert. There's just not a whole lot of vegetation or greenery once you get away from the river. Now here's that Fertile Crescent that I was talking about. So here is your Nile River on this side, and then you've got your Tigris River to the north, and your Euphrates River to the south. Okay, but they call it that Fertile Crescent because in this part of the world, that's really where these ancient groups of people were able to get stuff to grow. It was really the only part that there was fertile land. And the crescent part just comes from its shape. Okay, we've got the crescent roll that hopefully we'll be eating next Thursday. Hopefully your parents, your grandparents will make you some crescent rolls, but it has kind of that C shape to it. That's where the phrase comes from. Yeah, remember you're writing what's in. You guys will be writing what's in the blue here. The stuff that's in the orange is what's on your study guide. Yeah, the things that are written in orange is your terms or your questions. What's written in blue is what you're actually going to write down. But I keep talking about these first groups of people that lived here. That's going to be roughly 8,000 years ago. So, at this time, most humans were just nomadic. They were roaming the earth. They followed their food sources. So they fed themselves by either hunting wild animals, fishing, gathering wild fruits they could find, wild roots, grains, nuts. Pretty much anything that was edible, they would collect. So you might have small groups of people living together where the men might go hunting during the day and the women and children might collect these wild fruits, grains, nuts, vegetables, that kind of stuff, while the men were out hunting. But this hunting and gathering took place for a very, very, very long time. It's been estimated that roughly 99% of the time that humans have been on the earth, which is a very long time, they've been hunters and gatherers. And with this hunting and gathering, okay, we know that obviously animals move around, animals migrate. Well, the humans had to do the same thing. You had to follow the animals that you hunted, and once you picked through all the, the wild vegetation that you could eat in an area, you had to move on. So during the time period where people were hunters and gatherers, they didn't really build homes and stay in one place. They were constantly moving around. Does that sound like a great lifestyle? Not really, no. When you're constantly in search of food, if you don't catch or find anything to eat that day, you don't eat that day. You'll end up starving. So, what will eventually happen is these people are going to notice that next to these rivers, things grow more easily. And next to these rivers, you're going to have animals appear more easily. So people are going to want to settle next to these spots. Now, just being next to these rivers, doesn't necessarily make them great farming spots. There are some things that need to occur for this to happen. We already saw what the ground looked like in that part of the world. Very sandy, very rocky. You didn't see a whole lot of green in those pictures. That sandy, rocky soil contains a lot of salt. It's really hard for anything to grow in salty soil. But in the pictures that we're going to see here in a second, you're going to notice right next to the river on either side, it's very, very green. There's plenty of stuff growing right there next to it. That's because that ground and that soil next to the river is very fertile. There's a lot of nutrients and resources in that soil. That has to do with the flooding that occurs every year. These rivers are formed by very small springs and streams and mountaintop snow from mountains that are hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from these rivers. Obviously, water has to flow down. So as those snow caps melt in the mountains and those springs and small streams travel down that mountain, they eventually link up together and form rivers. Well, every year, there's going to be a flood season in this part of the world where those ice caps melt and everything, and it brings more water. As that water trickles down the mountain, it's going to bring some of that soil with it. Some of you might have a basement where if we get a lot of rain, you might get some water in your basement. And after the rain stops and after the water in your basement dries out or recedes back into the foundation or whatever, it usually leaves behind a little bit of that soil, doesn't it? Leaves a little patch of dirt. Okay, that's what's going to happen with this flood season. So let me show you that real quick. Let's say this is our this is our mountain range that's very far away, and this is our river. Okay, as this starts to melt, okay, and that water trickles down the mountain and eventually helps form our rivers. Well, when that river floods, okay, it's going to come out of the riverbank. If you've ever seen a river or a stream in our area after a heavy rain, what color's the water? It's not blue. It's usually brown. Well, why is it brown? Yeah, it's got all that dirt and soot and soil that's kicked up in it. So when that muddy water spills from the riverbanks, okay, it's not going to stay there forever. That water is eventually going to recede and go back down into the soil or back down into the ground. So when it does, it's going to leave behind a thin layer of that mud and that soot and all that nutrient-rich soil that was in the water before. Okay, so when that's laying there on the side of the riverbank, okay, you now have rich, fertile soil that things can now grow in. And you can plant crops in that soil so that it is not growing in that sandy, rocky desert.